Now, the rest of the story. Peggy would never forget September 1907. It was then that her mother, May Bell, enrolled her in the Forest Avenue Elementary School in Atlanta, and that morning, on the first day of the first grade, well, it was not a happy day. Peggy was upset by what she perceived as an unnecessary change in her life. She threw a tantrum is what she did. She would not go to school, she exclaimed through tears. She would stay with her mother, and things would always be as they always were. But this is the rest of the story. Mother Maybelle did not say a word. Instead, she went outside and hitched up the horse and buggy and took her daughter for a ride. The destination was a run-down section of town, a once grand and dignified neighborhood called Jonesboro. As the two drove along, Maybelle pointed to the proud old homes of yesteryear that now lay in ruins. "Look over there," Mother said. "Fine, wealthy families used to live in those houses." And yet the gardens that had once exploded with color were now choked with weeds, just as the glorious bygone days of Jonesboro had been suffocated by a grim and unpredictable future. What happened to everybody, little Peggy wanted to know. Maybelle pulled back on the reins. The buggy stopped. It was very simple, she explained, looking deep into her young daughter's eyes. Before the war between the states, the young women who lived in Jonesboro were content to be charming and social, but they embroidered their lives away. For after the war had deprived them of their means, they had nothing left to rely on. They had no skills, no education. Should your own world explode someday, Maybelle said, a new world would replace it. But when everyone loses everything, everyone is equal, except for what each person possesses inside his own brain. Well, little Peggy listened and understood. If she did not go to school, she would end up like the unfortunate inhabitants of Jonesboro, wasting away, depending upon the kindness of strangers. And Peggy never forgot that hot September day. And one day she wrote about it. No, not precisely as it happened, but rather she patterned a character in a novel, in part after her own mother, and made the character say the things that her mother had said. You never knew until right now, but the person in the book is, more than anyone who ever lived, like Peggy's mother, Maybelle Mitchell. Of course, you know Peggy's masterpiece, Margaret Mitchell's American masterpiece, has Gone with the Wind. And if you are sufficiently familiar with the dialogue therein, you have recognized Maybelle and her long-ago admonition as words straight from the mouth of, no, not from Scarlett O'Hara. Margaret Mitchell immortalized her mother's strength, her mother's independence, her mother's common sense, even her mother's own words. In a fictional character the whole world came to love and to admire. That fictional character, with the ultimate truth from his lips, was Rhett Butler. Only now you know the rest of the story.
And now, the rest of the story. Gone with the Wind, the film and the book are indelible parts of American culture. The characters Margaret Mitchell created are as much a part of our country as Mark Twain's Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn. They are part of the fabric of America. Margaret Mitchell was born in November 1900 in Atlanta, Georgia. When Margaret was about 3 years old, her dress brushed up against a hot iron grate and caught fire. Now, Margaret was unharmed, but her mother feared that her daughter might not be so lucky next time. Margaret's mother began dressing her in boys' clothing. Someone, purportedly her only sibling, a brother named Alexander, jokingly called her Jimmy, and the nickname stuck. Margaret was called Jimmy until she began to develop into a young woman at the age of 14. It was only then that she was able to shake off the nickname that she so despised. Some people have concluded that Margaret was nicknamed after the comic strip character Little Jimmy, but there's just one problem. Let me explain here. The Little Jimmy comic strip was first published on Valentine's Day in 1904 when Margaret was 3 years old. No problem there. Little Jimmy was published sporadically in the New York Journal. Now remember, Margaret was down in Georgia. The earliest Little Jimmy comic strip I found in any newspaper in Georgia was in the Atlanta Georgian in February of 1914, but it was a one-off comic strip and Little Jimmy didn't even make an appearance. The Little Jimmy comic strip first became a regular comic strip in a Georgian newspaper called the Macon News in February of 1919 when Margaret was 18 years old, long after she had lost the nickname Jimmy. As a child, Margaret's mother read to her constantly, and by the time she was 10 years old, Margaret had begun to create her own stories in which she added her own artwork. Mrs. Paisley, Margaret's high school English teacher, recognized her ability and encouraged her to write. Margaret, who by then was going by the name Peggy, thought her praise was undue. After high school, she briefly attended Smith College. On September 2, 1922, Margaret married Berrien Kennard Upshaw. Everyone called him Red. Red's best man at the wedding was John Robert Marsh. But their marriage was a violent one. Red was a bootlegger who often drank too much of his own product and became violent. In December, after less than 3 months of marriage, Red left. Maybe he was forced to leave, but he left. Margaret needed money. Despite the arguments from her family of what was expected by society of a young lady in Atlanta at the time, Margaret began working as a reporter for the Atlanta Journal. Now this was a big deal. Margaret was the very first female reporter in the whole state of Georgia. Her first story appeared in the Atlanta Journal on December the 31st, 1922, just days after Red left. Now Margaret wanted a divorce, but Red refused. Finally, Red agreed to a divorce, but only after getting a loan from his best man, John Marsh, to pay for the divorce, and after Margaret agreed not to press charges on him for beating her. Their divorce was finalized in October of 1924. On July the 4th, Independence Day of the following year, 1925, Margaret married John Marsh, the best man at her first wedding, the man who paid for her divorce. Margaret and John lived here in the Crescent Apartments in Atlanta. Margaret and John jokingly refer to it as the Dump. It's now the Margaret Mitchell House and Museum, which you can visit. While working as a reporter, Margaret injured one of her ankles, which was not healing properly. Less than 4 years into her reporting career, Margaret had no choice but to quit her job to be a full-time housewife. With more free time on her hands, Margaret read incessantly. Her husband John toted armloads of books back and forth between their apartment and the public library. Finally, John said something to the effect of, "For God's sakes, Peggy, can't you write a book instead of reading thousands of them?" Margaret instantly accepted the challenge. John bought her this Remington Portable No. 3 typewriter to work on her book. For 3 years, Margaret pecked away at this typewriter on her first novel, whose heroine was named Pansy O'Hara. Thankfully, before publication, she changed the name from Pansy to Scarlet. It was first published in June of 1936 and became a bestseller. In the following year, Margaret received the Pulitzer Prize for the book. Just before the book was released, Margaret told Julia Harris of the Chattanooga Times about her writing it. "I suppose I started in the cradle," Margaret wrote. "Father is an authority on Atlanta and Georgia history of that period, and Mother knew about as much as he did. On Sunday afternoons, when we went calling on the older generation of relatives, those who had been active in the 60s, meaning the 1860s, I sat on bony knees of veterans and fat, slippery laps of great aunts and heard them talk about, how Grandpa Mitchell walked nearly 50 miles after the Battle of Sharpsburg with his skull cracked in 2 places from a bullet." Margaret described the 2 years after publishing Gone with the Wind as months of torment mixed with joy beyond comprehension. Letters and phone calls inundated Margaret's home. In a letter to a friend, Margaret wrote, "I hired another secretary, and John and I and the 2 young ladies have been working as if we were shoveling coal." In 1936, Time magazine sent a telegram to Margaret about Gone with the Wind. Margaret's husband wired back, "Mrs. Marsh, sick in bed as a result of strain of becoming too famous." The strain continued for many years with the help of the film. On December 16, 1939, Margaret and John went to the premiere of the film Gone with the Wind. Before the film began, Margaret made a short speech from the stage. When she finished, the crowd erupted in cheers. After the film, everyone wanted to meet and shake hands with the author. She hosted what newspapers reported as a late party for the famous visitors. Margaret had been besieged with famous visitors for 3 full days surrounding the film's premiere. At the 12th Academy Awards, Gone with the Wind received 10 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Adapted Screenplay, Best Actress to Vivien Leigh for her portrayal of Scarlett O'Hara, and Best Supporting Actress to Hattie McDaniel for her portrayal of Mamie. Hattie McDaniel was the first African American to win an Academy Award. Gone with the Wind is regarded as one of the greatest films ever made. But Margaret never published another novel. She, her husband, and her brother fought for decades to protect the copyright of her book abroad. See, international copyright laws at the time were vague, and they varied from country to country. On the evening of August 11, 1949, Margaret and John were on their way to a neighborhood theater to see the film A Canterbury Tale. As they crossed Peachtree Street at 13th Street in Atlanta, Margaret was hit by a speeding car driven by a drunk off-duty taxi driver. Margaret never fully regained consciousness. 40-year-old Margaret Mitchell died 5 days later. In the nearly 100 years since she first published it, the book Gone with the Wind has been translated into many languages and remains popular throughout the world. The film has remained popular as well. Now imagine for a second that Margaret Mitchell had not injured her ankle. Imagine if her husband had not gotten fed up with carrying armloads of books back and forth between the apartment and the library. If those 2 things had not happened, we would have never known Gone with the Wind. I'm Brad Dison. Thanks for watching. And now you know the rest of the story.